My body is my choice. You can't demand anything from me, Trevor said, his voice cold as ice as he turned away from me in our bedroom. The words hit me like a physical blow, leaving me standing there in the silk nightgown I had carefully chosen for our 6-week anniversary. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of marriage, and my husband had not touched me once. My name is Justine Crawford, and at 27, I thought I had found my fairy tale ending when Trevor Caldwell proposed to me last spring in Denver, Colorado. The wedding had been everything I dreamed of, a beautiful ceremony at the prestigious Highlands Country Club, surrounded by friends and family who celebrated what they believed was the beginning of my happily ever after. But as I stood in our bedroom that night, watching my husband's rigid back as he pretended to read his phone, I realized that something was terribly, devastatingly wrong. "Trevor, we're married," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I'm your wife. I just want to understand why you won't even hold my hand, let alone—" "Don't finish that sentence," he snapped, finally turning to face me. His green eyes, once warm and loving during our courtship, now held nothing but annoyance. "I told you, my body belongs to me. Marriage doesn't give you ownership over it. You need to respect my boundaries." The word boundaries felt like a slap. During our 8-month courtship, Trevor had been affectionate, romantic even. He would pull me close during movies, kiss me goodnight after dates, and hold my hand as we walked through Washington Park. But the moment we returned from our honeymoon in Aspen, a honeymoon where he had claimed exhaustion every single night, everything changed. It was as if a switch had been flipped, transforming the man I married into a stranger who flinched whenever I came near him. "This isn't normal," I said, my voice gaining strength. "Married couples are intimate. They share a bed, they touch each other, they—" "Normal?" Trevor laughed bitterly. "You want to talk about normal? Normal is respecting your partner's choices. Normal is not pressuring someone into physical contact they don't want." I stared at him, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. His words were technically correct. Consent mattered, boundaries mattered. But something felt deeply wrong about the way he wielded these concepts like weapons against his own wife. The Trevor who had courted me, who had whispered sweet words about our future together, who had seemed desperate to marry me, had vanished completely. As he stalked out of the bedroom, leaving me alone with my confusion and growing suspicion, I made a decision that would change everything. Something was very wrong with my marriage, and I was going to find out what. The next morning, I sat at our kitchen table, staring at my untouched coffee as Trevor moved around the kitchen with mechanical precision. He had always been organized, but lately his routines felt almost obsessive. He checked his phone constantly, stepped outside to take calls, and had developed a habit of disappearing for hours without explanation. "I'm going to visit my sister in Phoenix this weekend," I announced, watching his reaction carefully. Trevor's hand froze on his coffee mug for just a moment before he nodded. "That sounds nice. How long will you be gone?" "Just the weekend. Why? Will you miss me?" I asked, testing the waters. He shrugged without looking at me. "I'll manage." The casual dismissal of my absence should have hurt, but instead, it confirmed what I had been suspecting. Trevor seemed relieved whenever I left the house. During our courtship, he had hated when business trips separated us even for a day. Now, he practically encouraged my absence. I studied his profile as he scrolled through his phone. Trevor was undeniably handsome, tall, with thick dark hair and those striking green eyes that had first caught my attention at a coffee shop downtown. He worked as a financial consultant, or so he claimed, though I had never met any of his colleagues or clients. When I asked about his work, he would give vague answers about confidentiality and client privacy. "Trevor," I said carefully, "I was thinking we should see a marriage counselor. This distance between us, it's not healthy." His head snapped up, and for a moment, I saw something flash in his eyes. Panic, maybe, or fear. But it was gone so quickly I wondered if I had imagined it. "We don't need counseling," he said firmly. "We just need time to adjust to married life. Not everyone falls into perfect rhythm immediately." "It's been 6 weeks," I reminded him. "6 weeks is nothing in the scope of a lifetime together," he replied, but his voice sounded rehearsed, as if he had practiced this response. That afternoon, after Trevor left for what he claimed was a client meeting, I did something I had never imagined myself doing. I searched through his things. Not out of jealousy, but out of a growing conviction that the man I married was keeping secrets from me. His home office was meticulously organized, almost suspiciously so. His desk drawers contained only basic office supplies, his filing cabinet held generic financial documents, and his computer was password protected. But as I was about to give up, I noticed something odd. In the trash can, partially hidden beneath other papers, was a receipt from a flower shop in Las Vegas. The date was from 3 weeks ago, when Trevor claimed to be at a financial conference in Salt Lake City. The receipt was for a dozen red roses, and written on the back in Trevor's handwriting was a phone number with a Nevada area code. My hands trembled as I photographed the receipt with my phone. Whatever Trevor was hiding, I was going to find out. The man I married was living a lie, and I deserved to know the truth. That evening, I sat in my car outside the office building where Trevor claimed to work, watching through the lobby windows. I had called his supposed workplace earlier, asking to speak with Trevor Caldwell, only to be told that no one by that name was employed there. The security guard I spoke with was apologetic but firm. He had worked there for 5 years and had never heard of Trevor. When Trevor's car pulled into the parking lot at 6 p.m., I slumped down in my seat, watching as he sat in his vehicle for several minutes, talking animatedly on his phone. Even from a distance, I could see his body language was completely different from the cold, distant man he became at home. He was smiling, laughing even, gesturing with his free hand like he was having the most wonderful conversation of his life. After 20 minutes, he ended the call and walked into the building. Not to an office, but to the coffee shop on the ground floor. He ordered a drink and sat at a corner table, pulling out his laptop. For the next hour, he appeared to be working, but something about the scene felt staged, performative. When he finally left, he threw away what looked like fake paperwork and drove home. I followed at a safe distance, my mind racing. The man I married was not who he claimed to be. The question was, what was he hiding, and why had he married me? When I arrived home 10 minutes after him, Trevor was already in the shower. I seized the opportunity to examine his phone, which he had left charging on the nightstand. It was locked, but I remembered him entering his passcode once, our wedding date. My heart pounded as I typed in the numbers, and miraculously, the phone unlocked. What I found made my blood run cold. Text messages with someone named Amanda, filled with intimate exchanges and declarations of love. Photos of Trevor with a woman I didn't recognize, both wearing wedding rings, standing in front of what appeared to be a courthouse. The most recent message, sent just hours ago, read, "Missing you, baby. Can't wait to see you this weekend. This whole situation is almost over." The shower was still running when I forwarded the most damning photos and messages to my own phone, then carefully placed Trevor's phone back where I found it. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip my own device as I stared at the evidence of what appeared to be Trevor's double life. When Trevor emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel and humming softly, I was sitting on the bed, pretending to read a magazine. He seemed genuinely happy for the first time in weeks, and now I understood why. He was living 2 lives, and apparently, his life with me was the one he wanted to end. "I think I'll turn in early tonight," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Good idea," Trevor replied, and I didn't miss the relief in his voice. "Sweet dreams, Justine." As I lay in the dark, listening to his even breathing beside me, I made a decision that would shatter both our lives. Tomorrow I would contact a lawyer and find out exactly who I had married. The law office of Patricia Henley was located in downtown Denver, occupying the 15th floor of a gleaming high-rise with panoramic views of the Rocky Mountains. I had chosen Patricia specifically because of her reputation for handling complex divorce cases, but as I sat across from her mahogany desk, sharing the evidence I had gathered, I realized I was dealing with something far more sinister than a simple marital breakdown. "Justine," Patricia said, her voice grave as she studied the photos on my phone. "What you're showing me suggests potential bigamy. This isn't just grounds for divorce. This could be criminal." The word bigamy hit me like a physical blow. I had suspected an affair, maybe even that Trevor had married me for financial reasons, but the possibility that he was already married to someone else had never crossed my mind. "That's impossible," I whispered. "We have a marriage certificate. We were married by a licensed officiant at the country club. There were over 200 witnesses." Patricia nodded grimly. "Your marriage is legally valid on your end, which makes Trevor's situation extremely problematic if he's already married to someone else. Bigamy is a felony in Colorado, punishable by up to 6 years in prison." She reached for her phone. "I'm going to recommend we hire a private investigator immediately. We need to determine if this Amanda person is actually Trevor's wife, and if so, when and where they were married. If their marriage predates yours, then your marriage is void, and Trevor has committed a serious crime." Within hours, I found myself in the office of Detective Michael Torres, a former police officer turned private investigator who specialized in marriage fraud cases. He was a compact man in his 50s, with sharp eyes and a direct manner that immediately put me at ease. "I've seen cases like this before," he said, making notes as I recounted my story. "The pattern is usually the same. The perpetrator researches wealthy targets, courts them quickly, rushes into marriage, and then tries to access their finances before disappearing. The lack of intimacy is a red flag. Many of these fraudsters avoid physical contact because it complicates their exit strategy." "But Trevor seemed so genuine when we were dating," I protested. "He was romantic, attentive. He seemed to really care about me." Detective Torres looked at me with something approaching sympathy. "These people are skilled manipulators, Justine. They research their targets extensively, learn their interests, their backgrounds, their vulnerabilities. They become whoever they think you want them to be." He pulled out a contract. "I need you to understand that what we might discover could be very painful. Are you prepared for the possibility that everything about your relationship was a lie?" I thought about the past 6 weeks of confusion and rejection, about the cold stranger sharing my bed, about the phone calls and mysterious absences. Whatever the truth was, it couldn't be worse than the uncertainty I was living with. "I need to know," I said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Detective Torres nodded and began outlining his investigation plan. He would start by running comprehensive background checks on Trevor Caldwell, searching marriage records in multiple states, and attempting to identify and locate Amanda. He would also investigate Trevor's claimed employment and financial history. "One more thing," he said, handing me a small recording device. "If Trevor makes any admissions or threats, we need them on record. Colorado is a one-party consent state, so you can legally record conversations you're part of without his knowledge." As I left the detective's office, the small recording device felt heavy in my purse. I was about to embark on an investigation that would either save my marriage or destroy it completely. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was taking control of my situation instead of being a passive victim of Trevor's manipulations. That evening, I watched Trevor across the dinner table, studying his face for any sign of the man I thought I had fallen in love with. He seemed relaxed, almost cheerful, making small talk about his day while I mechanically ate my pasta. Every smile, every casual comment, every moment of apparent normalcy now felt like an elaborate performance designed to deceive me. When he excused himself to take a phone call in his office, I turned on the recording device and followed him, positioning myself outside the door. "I know, baby. I miss you too." Trevor's voice carried through the thin office door. tender and loving in a way I hadn't heard since our honeymoon. This whole situation is more complicated than I expected, but I promise it'll be over soon. I pressed closer to the door, my heart hammering as I listened to what was clearly an intimate conversation with another woman. No, she doesn't suspect anything, Trevor continued. She's actually making it easier by pulling away herself. I think she's planning to file for divorce, which would solve all our problems. Once the papers are signed, I can access the trust fund and transfer everything before she realizes what happened. The casual cruelty in his voice made my stomach lurch. He was talking about me like I was nothing more than a business transaction, a problem to be solved. The prenup was a stroke of genius, he continued. She was so in love she barely read it. If she files for divorce within the first year, she gets nothing, but I get half of any assets she brought into the marriage. That includes the trust fund her grandmother left her. I had to grip the doorframe to keep from collapsing. The prenuptial agreement Trevor had insisted on, claiming it would protect both our interests, was actually designed to rob me blind. He had manipulated me into signing away my own inheritance. I love you too, Amanda, Trevor said, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. Tell me about your day. How was work? For the next 10 minutes, I listened to Trevor have the kind of loving, attentive conversation I had desperately craved from him. He asked about Amanda's job as a nurse in Las Vegas, remembered details about her colleagues, made plans for their weekend together. He was everything to her that he refused to be to me. When he finally ended the call, I crept back to the living room and turned off the recording device, my hands shaking as I processed what I had just learned. Trevor hadn't just married me while already married to someone else. He had orchestrated an elaborate fraud designed to steal my inheritance. The prenup, his rejection of intimacy, even his encouragement of my independence, were all part of a calculated plan to rob me and disappear. The next morning, while Trevor was supposedly at work, Detective Torres called with his preliminary findings. I have good news and bad news, he said. The bad news is that Trevor Caldwell married Amanda Wilson in Las Vegas 8 months ago, 2 months before he proposed to you. Their marriage is fully legal and documented. My worst fears were confirmed, but Detective Torres continued. The good news is that this makes your case straightforward. Trevor committed bigamy when he married you, and the evidence you recorded last night proves intent to commit marriage fraud. We have enough to file criminal charges and void your prenup based on fraud. What happens now? I asked, feeling strangely calm despite the magnitude of what I had learned. Now we set a trap, Detective Torres said. Based on the conversation you recorded, Trevor is planning to access your trust fund soon. We need to catch him in the act. Are you willing to let this play out a little longer to gather more evidence? I thought about the man who had swept me off my feet with romantic gestures and promises of forever, who had turned out to be a criminal using me for my money while loving someone else. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined, but beneath the pain was something harder and more determined. Yes, I said firmly. Let's catch this bastard. Detective Torres had been thorough in setting up surveillance, but what he discovered over the next week exceeded even his expectations. Trevor wasn't just a bigamist. He was part of a larger pattern of marriage fraud that had been going on for years. We've identified at least 3 other women in different states who married men matching Trevor's description, Detective Torres explained during our meeting at Patricia's office. Same methodology, whirlwind courtship, quick marriage, access to finances, then disappearance. We think Trevor and Amanda work as a team. The surveillance photos he showed me were devastating. Trevor and Amanda at dinner in Las Vegas, holding hands and laughing. Trevor entering and leaving an apartment that was clearly their shared home. Most damning of all, photos of them at a bank, where Amanda waited in the car while Trevor went inside with what appeared to be financial documents. He's been using your marriage certificate and the forged documents to establish himself as your legal husband with financial institutions, Patricia explained. The plan seems to be to drain your accounts and then file for divorce under the prenuptial agreement, claiming you were unfaithful or abandoned the marriage. How is that possible? I asked. I would have noticed money missing from my accounts. Detective Torres pulled out another folder. He's been more sophisticated than that. He's opened new accounts using your social security number and marriage certificate, then applied for lines of credit against your trust fund. He hasn't touched your existing accounts yet because that would trigger immediate alerts, but he's created a shadow financial identity that he can drain all at once. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Trevor had been planning this for months, possibly even before we met. Every romantic gesture, every declaration of love, every moment of apparent happiness had been calculated to manipulate me into the perfect position to be robbed. "There's something else," Detective Torres said, his expression grim. "Amanda isn't just his wife, she's his sister." The room spun around me. "What?" "Amanda Wilson was born Amanda Caldwell. They've been running marriage fraud schemes together for at least 5 years. She provides legitimacy to his operations by playing the role of the devoted wife back home, while he targets wealthy women in other states." I felt physically sick. The intimate phone calls I had overheard, the declarations of love, the romantic photos, it was all part of an incestuous criminal partnership that made my skin crawl. Patricia leaned forward. "Justine, we have enough evidence to destroy them both. Trevor will face federal charges for mail fraud, wire fraud, bigamy, and identity theft. Amanda will be charged as an accomplice, but we need to catch them in the act of actually accessing your funds." "How do we do that?" Detective Torres smiled grimly. "We give them what they want. You're going to file for divorce just as Trevor hopes, but instead of using his prenup to rob you, we're going to use it to trap him." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, playing the role of the heartbroken wife who just wanted out of the marriage. Trevor would feel confident that his plan was working, and would move quickly to access the financial accounts he had set up. Federal agents would be waiting for him. "Are you ready for this?" Patricia asked. "Once we set this in motion, there's no going back. Trevor will be arrested, and the truth about your marriage will become public record." I thought about the past 2 months of confusion and rejection, about the elaborate lies and manipulation, about the trust fund my grandmother had left me being used as bait in a criminal scheme. "I'm ready," I said. "Let's end this charade once and for all." The Denver County Courthouse was bustling with activity on the morning I filed for divorce, but I felt strangely calm as I walked up the steps with Patricia beside me. Detective Torres had positioned himself across the street, ready to alert the federal agents once Trevor took the bait. I had served Trevor with divorce papers the night before, playing the part of the devastated wife who couldn't handle the distance in our marriage any longer. His reaction had been perfect. Surprise, hurt, and then resigned acceptance that made my skin crawl with its falseness. "I'm sorry it's come to this," he had said, pulling me into what I now recognized as a calculated embrace. "I know I haven't been the husband you deserved. Maybe some time apart will help us both figure out what we really want." The recording device in my pocket had captured every lying word. Now, as Patricia filed the paperwork that would officially dissolve my sham marriage, my phone buzzed with a text from Detective Torres. "He's moving. Entered First National Bank downtown with Amanda. Federal agents in position." My heart raced as I imagined Trevor finally making his move, probably feeling confident that his plan had worked perfectly. He thought he was about to walk away with my inheritance while leaving me with nothing but a fraudulent prenup and a broken heart. "It's done," Patricia said, handing me copies of the divorce filing. "According to Colorado law, he has 30 days to respond, but something tells me he won't get the chance." My phone buzzed again. "Package delivered. Both subjects in custody. You can go home, Justine. It's over." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. The man who had manipulated and lied to me, who had planned to rob me and disappear, was finally facing the consequences of his crimes. The arraignment hearing was held 2 weeks later in federal court, and I sat in the gallery watching as Trevor and Amanda were led into the courtroom in orange jumpsuits and shackles. Trevor's confident composure had completely crumbled. His face was pale, his hands shook, and he kept looking around the courtroom like he couldn't believe where he had ended up. The defendants, Trevor James Caldwell and Amanda Marie Caldwell, are charged with conspiracy to commit mail fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, and bigamy, the prosecutor announced. The government alleges that the defendants operated a criminal enterprise targeting wealthy women for fraudulent marriages designed to steal their assets. When Trevor's eyes found mine across the courtroom, I saw the exact moment he realized that I had known about his scheme all along. The shock on his face was quickly replaced by something closer to panic as the full weight of his situation hit him. "Your Honor," Trevor's court-appointed attorney said, "my client maintains his innocence and requests bail consideration." The prosecutor stood immediately. "Your Honor, Mr. Caldwell is a flight risk who has demonstrated a pattern of creating false identities and fraudulent financial relationships. The government requests he be held without bail." Amanda sat beside him, tears streaming down her face as she realized their criminal partnership was over. The intimate phone calls, the romantic photographs, the elaborate deception that had been their livelihood. It was all evidence now, proof of a disturbing criminal conspiracy that would put them both in prison for years. The judge's voice was stern as he denied bail for both defendants. "The evidence presented suggests a sophisticated criminal enterprise that poses a continued danger to the community. Both defendants will be remanded to custody pending trial." As the bailiffs led Trevor away, he looked back at me one final time, his face a mask of defeat and disbelief that his perfect plan had destroyed him completely. Trevor Caldwell received a 12-year federal sentence for his role in the marriage fraud conspiracy, while Amanda received 8 years for her part as an accomplice. The investigation revealed they had stolen nearly $2 million from victims across 6 states, money that was recovered and returned to the women they had targeted. Their criminal enterprise collapsed completely when other victims came forward, inspired by my case to seek justice for their own experiences with the siblings' manipulative schemes. Trevor's reputation was permanently destroyed when media coverage made him notorious as one of the most calculating marriage predators in recent memory, ensuring he would never again be able to manipulate vulnerable women seeking genuine love. I celebrated my legal victory quietly, having dinner with my sister and close friends who had supported me through the investigation and trial. Looking back on my journey from confused newlywed to determined survivor, I realized that Trevor's betrayal, as devastating as it was, had taught me to trust my instincts and fight for myself when something felt wrong. The revenge I had sought wasn't just about punishing him. It was about reclaiming my power and ensuring that no other woman would fall victim to his lies. "Brilliant! She knew you only deserved this piece of trash." My brother Edward burst into laughter, his voice echoing through the mahogany-paneled office. I sat there, stunned, clutching the brass key that Harrison Phillips, our family attorney, had just handed me. The old wooden box sat before me on the polished conference table, looking so ordinary next to all the legal documents scattered around us. My name is Bethany Crow, and at 37 years old, I never imagined this moment would feel so humiliating. After working a double shift at Denver General Hospital, I had rushed here still wearing my scrubs, my hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, exhaustion weighing heavy on my shoulders. Meanwhile, Edward had arrived in his tailored designer suit, his confidence radiating through the room like he already owned everything in it. The reading of our mother Margaret's will should have been a time of mourning, a moment to honor the woman who had raised us after our father died when I was just 16. Instead, it felt like a public execution of my dignity. Harrison had just finished reading the initial will, which left me nothing but this weathered wooden box that our mother had kept locked under her bed for as long as I could remember. Edward was set to inherit the vast majority of our family's $15 million estate, including the sprawling ranch house in Boulder, the investment properties, and all the stocks and bonds that had sustained our family for generations. "I mean, look at her," Edward continued, gesturing at my hospital uniform with undisguised contempt. "Still playing nurse at her age, living in that cramped apartment with her kid. Mother finally realized who the real success story is in this family." The words cut deep, but they weren't entirely surprising. Edward had always been the golden child, the one who charmed everyone with his smooth talk and expensive gifts. At 41, he lived in a luxury penthouse downtown, drove a BMW, and worked in some vague business consulting role that seemed to require more networking than actual work. He had spent years cultivating the image of the perfect son, the one who would carry on the family legacy with style and sophistication. I looked down at the simple wooden box, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. There was something almost mocking about it sitting there among all the official legal documents. Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension in the room. The afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the conference table, making the whole scene feel surreal and dreamlike. What had our mother been thinking, leaving me this old box while giving Edward everything else? After everything I had sacrificed, all the nights I had worked extra shifts to pay for nursing school, all the times I had visited her when Edward was too busy with his social calendar. The injustice of it all made my chest tighten with a mixture of grief and disbelief. Growing up, things had been different between Edward and me. Before our father's sudden death from a heart attack, we had been a typical family. Our mother, Margaret, worked as a school principal. Our father owned a small but successful construction company, and we lived comfortably in a modest home in Aurora. Edward was 4 years older than me, and back then, he had actually been protective of his little sister. We would spend summer afternoons riding bikes through the neighborhood, and he would help me with my math homework without complaint. But everything changed after Dad died. Suddenly, our family was thrust into wealth we had never expected. Dad's construction company was bought out by a larger corporation for millions, and various insurance policies and investments left us with more money than we knew what to handle. Mother was overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing such wealth while grieving, and Edward seemed to transform overnight from a protective older brother into someone I barely recognized. He became obsessed with appearances and status. At 18, he convinced Mother to buy him an expensive car, claiming it was necessary for his college image. He enrolled in an expensive private university, changed his wardrobe entirely, and started running with a crowd of wealthy kids who looked down on anyone who wasn't from old money. When I was still struggling through high school, dealing with my own grief and trying to help Mother manage her new responsibilities, Edward was learning how to manipulate social situations to his advantage. By the time I graduated and told Mother I wanted to become a nurse, Edward was openly dismissive. "Why waste time with some blue-collar job?" he had said during one particularly harsh family dinner. "We have money now, Bethany. You could do something important, something that matters." But nursing did matter to me. I had spent so many hours in the hospital with Dad before he died, watching the nurses who showed genuine compassion and skill. I wanted to help people the way they had helped our family during the darkest time. Edward never understood that. He saw my career choice as beneath our family's new station, an embarrassment that reflected poorly on him when he was trying to establish himself in Denver's social circles. When I got pregnant at 25 with my daughter Emma, and Emma's father disappeared rather than take responsibility, Edward's disappointment reached new heights. "Great," he had muttered when Mother told him the news. "Now she's going to be a single mother and a nurse. What will people think?" Mother had been supportive through it all, helping with Emma when she could, and never making me feel ashamed of my choices. But I had noticed over the years how Edward worked to undermine my relationship with her. He would make subtle comments about my financial struggles, my long work hours, the small apartment Emma and I shared. He painted himself as the responsible son who was building something important, while portraying me as the daughter who was content with mediocrity. Sitting in that conference room now, I realized just how effective his campaign had been. Somehow, he had convinced our mother that he deserved the lion's share of our family's wealth. The months leading up to Mother's death had been particularly difficult for me, though I didn't realize how much Edward had been manipulating the situation behind the scenes. Mother had been diagnosed with lung cancer the previous spring, despite never smoking a day in her life. The doctors said it was environmental, possibly related to years of exposure to construction dust from Dad's business. But the cause didn't matter as much as the reality that we were losing her. I had immediately rearranged my work schedule to spend more time with her, picking up extra shifts on weekends to make up for the reduced hours during the week. Emma, now 12, would often come with me to visit her grandmother after school. We would sit in Mother's sunroom, playing cards and talking about everything and nothing. Mother seemed to cherish these quiet moments, and I thought I was doing the right thing by prioritizing time with her over the financial stress it was causing. What I didn't know was that Edward was using my absence during his visits to plant seeds of doubt about my motives. Harrison would later tell me that Edward had spent considerable effort portraying my increased attention as self-serving. "She's only coming around more because she knows you're dying," he had apparently said on multiple occasions. "She's worried about the inheritance. She thinks if she plays the devoted daughter now, you'll forget about how distant she's been all these years." The cruel irony was that I had actually been distant, but not by choice. Working as a nurse, especially as a single mother, meant long hours and constant exhaustion. There were weeks when I barely saw Emma except to help her with homework and make sure she had clean clothes for school. Finding time to visit Mother regularly had always been a struggle, something that filled me with guilt, but seemed impossible to change without sacrificing my job security. Edward, meanwhile, had all the time in the world. His consulting work seemed to consist mainly of lunch meetings and networking events. He could drop by Mother's house on a whim, bearing expensive flowers and exotic teas, regaling her with stories of his business successes and social connections. He made sure she knew about every minor setback in my life. The month I was late on rent, the time Emma got suspended for talking back to a teacher, the car repairs that forced me to ask Mother for a small loan. The worst part was discovering that during Mother's final weeks, when she was heavily medicated and often confused, Edward had apparently spent hours talking to her about the future of the family wealth. Harrison later mentioned that Edward had brought up concerns about my ability to manage money responsibly, given my struggles as a single mother. He had positioned himself as the stable, reliable choice to preserve the family legacy, while subtly suggesting that leaving me a significant inheritance would be enabling my irresponsible lifestyle. Sitting in that conference room, holding the key to a wooden box while Edward gloated about inheriting millions, I felt the full weight of his manipulation crushing down on me. I had been so focused on loving our mother and spending quality time with her that I hadn't realized she was being systematically turned against me. "Sorry, Bethany, and here's the key," Harrison said gently, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine sympathy. His weathered face showed years of handling delicate family situations, and I could see in his eyes that he felt uncomfortable with the whole proceeding. He slid the small brass key across the polished conference table, and it made a tiny scraping sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent room. I picked up the key with trembling fingers, feeling its weight. It was old, probably from the 1970s based on its design, with an ornate head and a simple shaft. Edward was practically bouncing in his leather chair with excitement, clearly enjoying every moment of my humiliation. His perfectly styled hair caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, and his expensive cologne filled the air with its sickeningly sweet scent. "Go ahead. Open it," Edward urged, his voice dripping with mock encouragement. "Let's see what treasures Mother thought you deserved." He chuckled again, the sound making my stomach churn. "Maybe it's some old family photos or her jewelry from the 1960s. You know, sentimental stuff for the sentimental daughter." Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Edward, perhaps we should maintain some decorum during this difficult time," he said quietly, but Edward waved him off dismissively. "Oh, come on, Harrison. We're all family here. Besides, I'm sure Bethany is curious too. Aren't you, Beth?" He used my childhood nickname with such condescending familiarity that I wanted to scream. I mean, after all these years of wondering what was in Mother's mysterious locked box, now you finally get to find out. The wooden box sat before me, about the size of a shoebox but deeper, made from what looked like oak or maple. Its surface was worn smooth by decades of handling, and I could see scratches and small dents that told the story of its long existence. There was a simple brass lock mechanism on the front, tiny but sturdy. My hands shook as I inserted the key, and I had to try twice before it turned with a soft click. Edward leaned forward eagerly, his eyes bright with anticipation of whatever embarrassment awaited me inside. "This is better than Christmas morning," he said with genuine glee. "I wonder if she left you a note explaining why you deserved so little. Maybe some helpful advice about budgeting on a nurse's salary." I lifted the lid slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The box was lined with faded blue velvet, and inside, rather than the photo albums or jewelry Edward had mockingly suggested, there was a manila envelope. It was thick, much thicker than I would have expected for a simple keepsake or memento. Across the front, in Mother's careful handwriting, were the words, "My true will, to be opened only by Bethany Crow." The room fell silent. Edward's laughter died in his throat as he read the words on the envelope. Harrison leaned forward, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "That's unusual," he murmured, reaching for his reading glasses. "I wasn't aware of any second document." "What does it say?" Edward demanded, his voice suddenly sharp with concern. "What kind of true will?" "Harrison, you're her lawyer. You should know about any other documents." Harrison looked genuinely puzzled. "Margaret never mentioned any additional paperwork to me. This is highly irregular." He gestured toward the envelope. "May I see that, Bethany?" My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the envelope steady. The paper felt heavy, substantial, like it contained much more than just a letter. Through the manila, I could feel what seemed like multiple documents, possibly even photographs. "My true will," I read aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. Edward's confident demeanor was beginning to crack around the edges. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier smugness. "There's no such thing as a true will. Harrison, tell her this doesn't mean anything. The real will is the one you just read." Harrison adjusted his glasses and leaned back in his leather chair, his expression troubled. "I have to admit, this is unprecedented in my 40 years of practice. Margaret never mentioned any secondary documents or alternate arrangements. However," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "if this envelope contains a properly witnessed and notarized will that predates the document I just read, it could potentially supersede the previous version." Edward's face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan. "That's impossible," he said firmly, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Mother would have told us if she was changing her will. She would have discussed it with Harrison. This is probably just some sentimental letter or old family documents. It doesn't mean anything legally." "Actually," Harrison continued, his lawyer's mind clearly working through the possibilities, "there have been cases where individuals have chosen to keep their true intentions private, especially in families where there might be concerns about undue influence or manipulation." He looked directly at Edward as he said this, and I saw my brother flinch slightly. I carefully opened the envelope, my fingers still trembling with nervous energy. Inside, there were indeed multiple documents, exactly as I had suspected. The first was a thick legal document, clearly a will based on its format and official appearance. It was dated just 3 months ago, making it much more recent than the version Harrison had read. Below that were several photographs, and underneath everything was a sealed letter addressed to me personally. "The date on this will is October 15th, I said, my voice growing stronger as I realized the implications. "That's almost 2 months after the will you just read, Harrison." Edward stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the wall with a sharp bang. "Let me see that," he demanded, reaching across the table. "This is some kind of mistake or fraud. Mother was heavily medicated in October. She wasn't thinking clearly." Harrison held up a hand to stop Edward's advance. "Please, let's handle this properly. Bethany, may I examine the document?" I handed him the will with hands that were no longer shaking. As he began to read, his eyebrows climbed higher and higher on his forehead. After several minutes of careful review, he looked up with an expression of amazement. "This appears to be a legitimate legal document," he said slowly. "It's properly formatted, notarized, and witnessed. According to this will, Margaret Crow leaves 80% of her estate to Bethany Crow and 20% to Edward Crow." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Furthermore, there's a detailed explanation of her reasoning for this distribution." The blood drained completely from Edward's face. He stood frozen for a moment, then suddenly exploded into action. "That's impossible," he shouted, grabbing the edge of the conference table. "She promised me the majority. We discussed it dozens of times. She knew I was the responsible one, the one who would preserve the family wealth." "Edward, please calm down," Harrison said firmly. "Let me finish reading the supporting documents." But Edward was beyond calm. His carefully constructed facade of sophistication and control was crumbling before my eyes. "This is a fake," he declared, his voice rising to a near scream. "Someone forged this. Maybe Bethany did it herself. She had access to Mother's house. She could have planted this box. This whole thing is a setup." I found my voice at last. "Edward, stop. Just stop." The words came out stronger than I felt inside, but seeing his panic gave me confidence. "You know Mother always kept that box locked. You've made jokes about it for years, wondering what was inside. This isn't a fake." Harrison continued reading, his expression growing more serious with each page. "There are extensive notes here detailing Margaret's observations over the past several years. It appears she documented numerous instances of what she perceived as manipulative behavior and financial pressure from Edward, while also noting Bethany's consistent care and sacrifice." Harrison cleared his throat and began reading from Mother's letter, his voice taking on a formal legal tone. "I have spent the last several years carefully observing both of my children, and I have come to understand that my initial assessment of their characters was fundamentally flawed. I was influenced by Edward's charm and apparent success, but I failed to see the manipulation beneath his polished exterior." Edward slammed his hand on the conference table, making all the papers jump. "This is insane," he shouted. "She was dying, Harrison. She was on morphine, and who knows what other medications. She wasn't competent to make these kinds of decisions." Harrison held up a finger for silence and continued reading. "Edward has spent the past 5 years pressuring me for advances on his inheritance, claiming various business opportunities that required immediate capital. When I refused, he would become angry and manipulative, suggesting that my unwillingness to support him showed a lack of faith in his abilities. He made it clear that he expected the majority of the estate and felt entitled to it based on his education and social connections." My jaw dropped as Harrison read these words. I had known Edward was materialistic and entitled, but I hadn't realized he had been actively pressuring Mother for money. No wonder she had seemed stressed and worried during her final months. I had attributed her anxiety to her illness, never imagining that her own son was adding financial pressure to her emotional burden. "Meanwhile," Harrison continued, "Bethany has never asked me for anything beyond small emergency loans, which she always repaid promptly. She works double shifts to support her daughter, while still finding time to visit me regularly. When I was diagnosed with cancer, she immediately rearranged her entire schedule to spend more time with me, despite the financial hardship this caused her family." Edward's confident posture completely collapsed. He sank back into his chair, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. "She turned her against me," he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. "Bethany must have said something, poisoned her mind somehow." Harrison wasn't finished reading. "I have included photographs of the gifts Edward brought me during my illness, all of which had price tags still attached, showing that he considered these visits a financial investment rather than expressions of love. I also have documentation of the 3 separate occasions when he asked me to revise my will to increase his share, claiming that Bethany's lifestyle choices made her unfit to handle substantial wealth. The photographs Harrison mentioned were indeed in the envelope, and as he spread them out on the conference table, I could see the evidence of Edward's calculated approach to caregiving. Expensive flower arrangements with price tags visible, bottles of wine that still bore the store stickers showing their cost, even gift cards that highlighted their denominations. Each image told the story of someone who thought love could be purchased and measured. "The final reason for my decision," Harrison read, his voice growing quieter, "is that I have observed Bethany's genuine grief over her father's death and her authentic care for me during my illness. Edward's visits always included requests for money or discussions about inheritance. Bethany's visits were simply about spending time together. One child sees me as a bank account. The other sees me as a mother." Edward stood up slowly, his movements mechanical and strange. His face had gone from red to white, and he was staring at the photographs spread across the table like they were evidence of a crime. "This can't be happening," he whispered. "I planned everything so carefully. I was supposed to inherit the money. I need that money." The desperation in his voice was unlike anything I had ever heard from my confident, manipulative brother. For the first time in 20 years, Edward's mask had completely slipped away. The transformation in Edward was immediate and devastating. His perfectly styled hair fell across his forehead as he bent forward, gripping the edge of the conference table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The expensive suit that had made him look so confident and successful just minutes ago now seemed like a costume he was wearing for a role he had lost. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking with desperation. "I've already made commitments based on this inheritance. I bought the penthouse assuming I would have the money to pay for it. I've been living on credit for months, waiting for this day." Harrison folded the documents neatly, his professional demeanor never wavering despite the drama unfolding before him. "According to the legitimate will, the one your mother intended to be her final testament, you will inherit 20% of the estate, Edward. That's still approximately $3 million. Most people would consider that quite substantial." $3 million? Edward's voice rose to almost a shriek. "I was counting on 12 million. Do you know what I owe? The mortgage on the penthouse alone is $8,000 a month. The car payments, the credit cards, the country club membership I can't afford to cancel because of my business connections." He ran his hands through his hair, destroying his careful styling. "I built my entire lifestyle around getting that inheritance." I watched my brother's meltdown with a mixture of satisfaction and genuine shock. I had never seen him lose control like this, had never realized how precarious his financial situation really was. All these years, I had envied his apparent success while struggling to make ends meet on a nurse's salary, never imagining that his wealth was largely an illusion, built on borrowed money and future expectations. "Furthermore," Harrison continued calmly, "your mother included specific instructions that your 20% inheritance be placed in a trust with structured payments over 10 years, specifically to prevent you from squandering it impulsively. She was quite thorough in her planning." The words hit Edward like physical blows. A trust meant he couldn't access the full amount immediately, couldn't use it to solve his pressing financial crisis. His face crumpled completely, and for a moment, he looked like the frightened little boy I remembered from our childhood, the one who used to cry when Dad scolded him for breaking something. Edward's final desperate act came without warning. In a burst of rage that seemed to consume all his remaining composure, he drew back his fist and punched the mahogany-paneled wall behind him with tremendous force. The sound echoed through the quiet office like a gunshot, and I saw his knuckles split open immediately, blood beginning to drip onto Harrison's expensive carpet. "This is not happening," he screamed, cradling his injured hand against his chest. "I will contest this will. I'll prove she wasn't competent. I'll drag this through court for years if I have to." Harrison stood up slowly, his patience finally at its limit. "Edward, I need you to understand something very clearly. Your mother came to me 3 months ago, completely lucid and accompanied by 2 additional witnesses specifically to ensure the validity of this document. She anticipated that you might challenge her decision, so she took extraordinary precautions to make the will legally unassailable. The lawyer walked over to his filing cabinet and retrieved another thick folder. She also provided me with extensive documentation of her mental competence, including recent medical evaluations and cognitive assessments. Furthermore, she recorded a video statement explaining her reasoning, specifically addressing her concerns about your behavior and her confidence in Bethany's character. Edward's breathing was becoming rapid and shallow, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the office. His injured hand was leaving small drops of blood on his expensive suit jacket, creating dark stains that seemed symbolic of his entire situation. "She knew," he whispered, the realization finally hitting him. "She knew exactly what I was doing, and she was planning this the whole time." He looked at me with something approaching hatred. "While you were playing the perfect daughter, she was setting me up to fail." I found my voice, surprised by how steady it sounded. "No, Edward. While I was being a loving daughter, you were proving exactly why she made the right choice." Edward's lifestyle collapsed almost immediately after the will reading. Within 3 months, he was forced to sell his luxury penthouse at a significant loss when he couldn't maintain the mortgage payments. His BMW was repossessed, and his country club membership was revoked for non-payment of dues. The social circle that had once admired his apparent wealth abandoned him when they learned about his financial struggles and his mother's letter documenting his manipulative behavior. His consulting business, which had relied heavily on networking and the appearance of success, crumbled as potential clients lost confidence in someone who couldn't manage his own finances. Edward's attempts to contest the will failed miserably when the court reviewed Margaret's extensive documentation of her mental competence and her detailed reasoning for the inheritance distribution. While the legal fees consumed much of his reduced inheritance, leaving him bitter, broke, and alone, as I established the Margaret Crow Foundation for Single Mothers in Nursing, using a portion of my inheritance to help women facing the same struggles I had overcome, I realized that my mother's final gift had been far more valuable than money alone. She had shown me that genuine love and sacrifice would always triumph over manipulation and entitlement, and that sometimes the most profound revenge comes not from seeking to harm those who wronged you, but simply from living authentically while watching them face the natural consequences of their own choices. In the end, Mother had taught me that the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, but discovering that you never needed their approval to build a meaningful and fulfilling life. "You're worthless. I don't need you anymore, worthless woman." Derek's voice echoed through our living room in Fort Wayne, Indiana, as he threw my suitcase down the front steps. I stood there, stunned, watching 15 years of marriage crumble in the span of 10 minutes. My face was still hot from the tears I'd been shedding since he'd started packing my belongings with the enthusiasm of someone finally getting rid of unwanted clutter. "My name is Joanna, and at 42 years old, I never imagined I'd find myself homeless because my husband had suddenly decided he was too good for me." Theodore, his father, had passed away just 3 days earlier, and Derek was already acting like he owned the world. "I'm rich now, Joanna. $75 million, Derek shouted, his face flushed with excitement as he stood in our doorway. "I don't need some waitress dragging me down anymore. I'm gonna live like a king." The cruelty in his voice cut deeper than any physical blow could have. For 15 years, I had worked double shifts at Miller's Diner to keep us afloat, while Derek bounced between part-time jobs, claiming he was finding himself or waiting for the right opportunity. I had paid our mortgage, bought our groceries, and even covered his car payments when his employment was inconsistent, which was most of the time. "Derek, please," I whispered, my hands shaking as I picked up the suitcase. "We've been together for 15 years. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" He laughed, a harsh sound that made my stomach turn. "It means I wasted 15 years being held back by someone who wasn't good enough for me. Theodore always knew I'd amount to something great. That's why he left me everything." As I stood on the sidewalk, watching him close the door of what had been our home, I felt something inside me break. But it wasn't just heartbreak. there was something else brewing. A tiny voice in the back of my mind whispered that Derek might be celebrating a little too early. Theodore had always been kind to me, often more so than his own son, and I had spent countless hours caring for him in his final months, while Derek complained about the burden. The relationship with Theodore had been one of the few bright spots in my marriage. While Derek treated his father like an inconvenience, I had genuinely cared for the old man. After Theodore's first stroke 2 years ago, I was the one who drove him to physical therapy appointments when Derek was too busy playing video games. I cooked his favorite meals, helped him with his medication, and spent hours listening to his stories about building his construction empire from nothing. "You're a good woman, Joanna," Theodore had told me just a week before he passed. We were sitting on his back porch, watching the sunset while Derek was inside, probably on his phone. "You remind me of my wife, God rest her soul. She had the same kindness in her heart." I had smiled and patted his weathered hand. "You don't need to thank me, Theodore. Your family." The old man had looked at me with those sharp blue eyes that age hadn't dimmed. "Family isn't always about blood, dear. Sometimes it's about who shows up when it matters." At the time, I thought it was just the wisdom of an elderly man reflecting on life. I never imagined those words would prove prophetic. Derek's attitude toward his father's declining health had been embarrassing. He complained constantly about the smell of medications, the inconvenience of medical appointments, and the way Theodore's presence cramped his style. More than once, I caught Derek rolling his eyes when his father struggled with simple tasks or needed help getting around. "Why can't he just go to one of those homes?" Derek had grumbled to me after Theodore had a particularly difficult day following his second stroke. "I didn't sign up to be a caregiver." "He's your father," I had replied, shocked by his callousness. "And this is his house. We're living here because he invited us to stay after you lost your job at the warehouse." Derek had shrugged, already turning his attention back to his phone. "Whatever. Once he's gone, this place will be mine anyway. Then we can do whatever we want with it." The memory of that conversation now felt like a premonition. Theodore had witnessed his son's indifference and had clearly drawn his own conclusions about Derek's character. I remembered the way the old man's face had fallen when Derek made those comments, though he never said anything directly. Now, as I sat in my car in the parking lot of a budget motel, staring at the $43 in my wallet, I wondered if Theodore had seen something in those final months that the rest of us had missed. The funeral had been a small affair. Theodore hadn't had many close friends left, and Derek's behavior during the service had been shameful. Instead of mourning his father, Derek kept checking his phone and whispering to his brother Calvin about what they thought the inheritance would be worth. "I heard Dad's construction company was valued at $60 million last year," Calvin had whispered during the eulogy, "plus the house, the land, and all those investments." Derek had grinned like a child on Christmas morning. "I'm thinking of buying a boat first. Maybe one of those big yachts I saw in Miami." I had been mortified by their behavior, but I was even more disturbed by something else I noticed. Vincent Rodriguez, Theodore's estate lawyer, kept glancing at Derek with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't grief or sympathy. It was something closer to disapproval, mixed with what looked like anticipation. After the service, Vincent approached me with genuine warmth. "Joanna, I'm so sorry for your loss. Theodore spoke about you often. He was very fond of you." "Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. He was a wonderful man. I'm going to miss him terribly." Vincent nodded, then glanced over at Derek, who was already discussing vacation plans with Calvin. "The will reading is scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. Please make sure you're there." Something in his tone made me pause. "Me?" Derek said the lawyer told him it was just for family members. Vincent's expression darkened slightly. "Theodore specifically requested that you attend. In fact, he insisted on it. That conversation had stuck with me for the 3 days since the funeral. Derek had been so confident about his inheritance that he'd already started making plans. He'd called a real estate agent about selling Theodore's house, contacted a luxury car dealer about trading in his old pickup truck, and even started looking at expensive condos in downtown Indianapolis. But there had been something in Vincent's manner that suggested Derek's confidence might be misplaced. The lawyer had looked at Derek the same way a teacher might look at a student who hadn't studied for an important test. As I sat in that motel room, eating a sandwich from the gas station next door, I found myself thinking about all the small moments I'd shared with Theodore. The way he'd smile when I brought him his morning coffee. How he'd insist on paying for groceries when I drove him to the store. The times he'd tell me stories about his late wife, and how much I reminded him of her. "Derek doesn't deserve you," Theodore had said once, when Derek had been particularly dismissive of my work at the diner. "A man should appreciate a woman who works as hard as you do." Now, facing an uncertain future with almost no money to my name, I clung to those words like a lifeline. Maybe Thursday would bring more heartbreak, but something deep inside me whispered that it might bring something else entirely. Thursday arrived with the kind of gray, dreary weather that seemed to match my mood. I had spent the previous night at the Comfort Inn, using the last of my credit card availability to pay for the room. Derek hadn't called once to check on me, and when I'd tried calling him to discuss practical matters like our joint bank accounts, he'd sent me straight to voicemail. Vincent Rodriguez's law office was in a restored Victorian house downtown, with polished hardwood floors and walls lined with legal books. The waiting room smelled like leather and old paper, and classical music played softly from hidden speakers. It was the kind of place that suggested both tradition and serious money. Derek arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a new suit that he must have bought with money from our joint account. He walked in with the swagger of someone who believed he was about to become incredibly wealthy. Calvin was with him, both of them barely containing their excitement. "Sorry I'm late," Derek announced to the room, not sounding sorry at all. "I was on the phone with a yacht broker in Florida. Gotta start planning how to spend all this money, right?" He glanced at me sitting in the corner and his expression shifted to mild annoyance. "What's she doing here? This is family business." Vincent Rodriguez emerged from his office before I could respond. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of steady presence that inspired confidence. "Derek, Calvin, Joanna, thank you all for coming. Please follow me into the conference room." The conference room was dominated by a large mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs. Vincent took his place at the head of the table and opened a thick folder. Derek and Calvin sat on one side, while I took a chair across from them. The distance felt symbolic somehow. "Before we begin," Vincent said, adjusting his glasses, "I want to make sure everyone understands that this reading will proceed exactly as Theodore specified in his will. There will be no interruptions, no questions until I'm finished, and no disputes until the document has been read in its entirety." Derek leaned forward eagerly. "Whatever you say, Mr. Rodriguez. I'm ready to hear about my inheritance." Something in Vincent's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Derek, before we proceed, I have to ask, did you bother reading the copy of the will that was sent to you last week?" Derek waved his hand dismissively. "I skimmed it. All that legal language is confusing. I figured you'd explain everything today. Besides, I know Dad left everything to me. I'm his son." Vincent's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. And you, Calvin?" Calvin shrugged. "Same here. Derek said it was all just formalities anyway." Vincent looked directly at me. "Joanna, did you receive a copy?" I shook my head. Derek told me I didn't need to see it because it didn't concern me. For a moment, Vincent's professional composure cracked, and I saw something that looked like anger flash across his features. "That's unfortunate, because it concerns you very much indeed." The room fell silent. Derek's confident smile faltered slightly, while Calvin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I felt my heart begin to race, though I couldn't say exactly why. Vincent opened the folder and withdrew a thick document with official seals and ribbons. "The last will and testament of Theodore James Harrison," he announced formally. dated March 15th of this year. March 15th. That was just 2 months ago, well after Theodore's second stroke. My mind began to race, trying to remember what had been happening in our lives at that time. That was around when Derek had made his comment about putting Theodore in a nursing home, and when I'd started spending even more time caring for the old man. "Let's begin," Vincent said, and something in his tone suggested that nothing would ever be the same after the next few minutes. Vincent cleared his throat and began reading from the official document. "I, Theodore James Harrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby set forth my last will and testament. To my son, Derek Harrison, who has shown little appreciation for hard work or family loyalty, I leave the sum of $5,000 and my grandfather's fishing equipment, stored in the garage." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Derek's face went from confident anticipation to confusion to growing horror as the reality began to sink in. "Wait, what? That can't be right. $5,000? There has to be a mistake." Vincent held up his hand for silence and continued reading. "To my son, Calvin Harrison, who moved to California and visits perhaps twice a year, I leave $10,000 and my collection of vintage tools, with the hope that he might finally learn the value of building something with his own hands." Calvin's mouth fell open, but he seemed too stunned to speak. Derek, however, was beginning to panic. "This is impossible. I'm his son, his heir. Where's the rest of it? The $75 million? The company? The house?" Vincent's expression remained professionally neutral, but I could see satisfaction in his eyes. "If you had read the will as instructed, Derek, you would know that there is much more to be read. The bulk of the estate, Harrison Construction Company, valued at approximately $62 million, the family home and surrounding property, valued at $8 million, plus all liquid assets, investments, and personal property, totaling approximately $5 million, goes to someone else entirely." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Derek looked like he was about to be sick, his face pale and his hands shaking. "To Joanna Marie Harrison," Vincent continued, and my world tilted on its axis. "Who has shown more love, loyalty, and dedication to me in 15 years than my own blood relatives have shown in a lifetime? I leave the entirety of my remaining estate." The silence in the room was deafening. I felt like I couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I was hearing. Derek made a strangled sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "Theodore wrote a personal letter to accompany this bequest," Vincent said, withdrawing another document from the folder. "He asked that I read it aloud." Vincent unfolded the letter, and I recognized Theodore's careful handwriting on the cream-colored stationery. "My dear Joanna," he began, "if you are hearing this, then I have passed on, and you are learning for the first time that I have chosen to leave my life's work to you, rather than to my sons. This decision was not made lightly, nor was it made in anger. It was made with careful observation and deep consideration of who truly embodies the values that built Harrison Construction Company." Derek tried to interrupt, but Vincent continued reading without acknowledging him. "For 15 years, I watched you work multiple jobs to support my son while he chose leisure over labor. I watched you care for me in my illness with genuine compassion while Derek complained about the inconvenience. I watched you treat our home with respect while Derek saw it only as something to be sold for profit. Most importantly, I watched you demonstrate every day the qualities of character that I spent my lifetime trying to instill in my sons: kindness, integrity, dedication, and humility." By now, Derek was hyperventilating, and Calvin looked like he was in shock. But Vincent wasn't finished reading the letter. Vincent continued with Theodore's letter, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Joanna, you may wonder why I never spoke to you about this decision. The truth is, I wanted to observe how Derek treated you when he believed inheritance was certain. His behavior these past months, and particularly his treatment of you following my death, has only confirmed that I made the right choice." Derek suddenly lurched to his feet, knocking his chair backward. This is insane. She's not even blood family. You can't just give away my inheritance to some waitress. Vincent's voice turned ice cold. Sit down, Derek, or I'll have security escort you from the premises. Your father's will is legally binding, properly witnessed, and completely valid. Derek collapsed back into his chair, his face red and streaked with tears. There has to be something I can do. I'll contest it. I'll prove he wasn't in his right mind. I anticipated that response, Vincent replied calmly. Theodore underwent a complete psychological evaluation just weeks before signing this will. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the psychiatrist who conducted the evaluation, found him to be completely competent and clear-minded. Her report is part of the permanent record. He returned to the letter. Joanna, I hope you will use this inheritance wisely. Harrison Construction Company employs 43 people, and they are good people who deserve security. The company is profitable and well managed by my foreman, Robert Patterson, who has been with us for 22 years. I trust you will keep him on and learn the business gradually. I found my voice for the first time since the reading began. Mr. Rodriguez, I don't understand. How could Theodore have known that Derek would treat me the way he did? Vincent set down the letter and looked at me with gentle eyes. Theodore called me the day after he passed. He was still alive then, barely, but he was alert. He told me that Derek had already begun making plans to sell the house and had spoken cruelly to you about your future together. He asked me to make sure you attended this reading, knowing that Derek would likely try to exclude you. The room spun around me as the full magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. Theodore had not only witnessed Derek's true nature, but had planned this moment with the precision of a military operation. There's more, Vincent said, returning to the letter. Derek, if you are hearing this, know that I still love you as my son, but love alone cannot excuse a lifetime of taking advantage of others. Perhaps losing what you never truly earned will teach you the value of work and the importance of treating people with respect. Calvin, the same applies to you, though your sins are more of neglect than cruelty. Derek was openly sobbing now, the reality of his situation finally hitting home. He had thrown away a marriage and revealed his true character, all while unknowingly destroying his chances at the inheritance he'd been so confident about receiving. Vincent folded the letter and looked around the table. The will includes one final instruction. Joanna, Theodore has left you a sealed envelope that was to be given to you privately after the reading. Derek and Calvin, your inheritances will be distributed within 30 days, as required by law. The bulk of the estate transfer to Joanna will take several weeks to complete, but it is legally binding as of today. As Derek continued to sob and Calvin sat in stunned silence, I realized that my life had just changed completely. The woman who had been thrown out of her home 3 days ago was now the owner of a multi-million-dollar empire. But more than that, I had been validated by a man who had seen the worth in me that my own husband had refused to acknowledge. The revenge was complete, and Derek had orchestrated his own downfall with every cruel word and dismissive action. The aftermath of Vincent's revelation was swift and devastating for Derek. As the lawyer explained the immediate legal ramifications, Derek's world crumbled with each passing minute. The house he'd planned to sell wasn't his. The company he'd expected to inherit now belonged to the woman he'd called worthless. The $75 million he'd bragged about to friends and strangers alike had been a fantasy built on arrogance and entitlement. I need to speak with Joanna privately, Vincent announced as Derek continued to sob into his hands. Derek, Calvin, you're free to go. Someone from my office will contact you about collecting your inherited items. Derek looked up with desperate, red-rimmed eyes. Joanna, please, you have to understand. I didn't mean what I said. I was just upset about Dad dying. We can work this out, can't we? We're still married. The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. 3 days ago, he'd been eager to throw me away like garbage. Now that I controlled his father's fortune, he was begging for reconciliation. I looked at this man I'd supported for 15 years, who had shown his true colors the moment he thought he no longer needed me. "Derek," I said quietly, "you made it very clear that you don't need me anymore. You said I was worthless. You threw my belongings on the lawn and slammed the door in my face. Theodore saw who you really were, and frankly, so did I." His face contorted with panic and rage. "This isn't over. I'll fight this in court. I'll prove you manipulated him somehow." Vincent Rodriguez stepped between us. "Derek, I strongly advise against making threats. Your father's will is ironclad, and any attempt to contest it will only result in expensive legal fees you can no longer afford. You might want to focus on finding employment instead." Derek and Calvin left the office in devastation, their dreams of easy wealth shattered by their own character flaws. Through the conference room window, I watched Derek stumble toward his truck, a broken man who had destroyed his own future through greed and cruelty. Vincent handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Theodore's familiar handwriting. "He wanted you to read this privately," he said, then quietly left me alone in the conference room. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. "My dear Joanna," it began, "if you are reading this, then justice has been served, and Derek has received the shock he so richly deserved. I want you to know that my decision to make you my heir was not a punishment for Derek, though he will surely see it that way. It was recognition of your true worth." Tears blurred my vision as I continued reading. "You spent 15 years being undervalued and taken for granted by my son. You worked yourself to exhaustion to support a man who contributed nothing to your partnership. You cared for me in my final months with a tenderness that came from your heart, not from obligation. You are the daughter I never had, and the person most deserving of the life my money can provide." The letter concluded with practical advice about managing the construction company, and a suggestion that I consider establishing a foundation to help women in situations similar to what I'd endured. "Use this gift to build the life you deserve, and perhaps to help other women find their own worth." As I folded the letter, I felt a profound sense of closure. Theodore had not only secured my future, but had validated every sacrifice I'd made during my marriage to Derek. His final act had been one of justice, recognizing true character over blood relations. I walked out of that law office no longer as Derek's discarded wife, but as the owner of Harrison Construction Company and the architect of my own destiny. The revenge had been served not by me, but by a man who had observed, judged, and acted with the precision of someone who understood the true meaning of justice. Derek faced complete financial and social ruin in the weeks following the will reading. His premature celebration of an inheritance he never actually received became the subject of cruel gossip throughout Fort Wayne, as word spread that Theodore had deliberately chosen his daughter-in-law over his own son. Derek's attempt to contest the will failed spectacularly when the court reviewed Theodore's psychiatric evaluation and multiple witness testimonies about Derek's treatment of both his wife and his dying father. With only $5,000 to his name and no employable skills after years of depending on others, Derek was forced to move into his mother's basement apartment while facing the mockery of former friends who had watched him boast about wealth that was never his. His reputation was permanently destroyed, and potential employers invariably learned about the man who had been so worthless that his own father left millions to his ex-wife instead. 6 months later, as I signed the papers establishing the Theodore Harrison Foundation for Women's Independence, I smiled, knowing that his final gift had been more than financial security. It had been the recognition that my years of dedication and sacrifice had been noticed and valued by someone who truly mattered. Looking back on the journey from worthless castaway to empowered businesswoman, I understood that the best revenge had been allowing Derek to reveal his true character, while Theodore watched and judged accordingly.